like kind of a prominent figure within something with psychology, especially the frontal part, the lobe and everything.
Yeah.
I kind of didn't remember until then.
You know, later when we talk about memory, you'll understand why you have to repeat memories in order for them to stay firm in your mind, you know. So this stuff that I'm sharing with you now will be discussion type things, like in your chats, in your discussions. It's not in a quiz, like multiple choice quiz. And it's called the power of free won't. This isn't my phrase. This is a phrase I got from Dr. His name's going to come to me in a minute, who describes through a bunch of experimental tests that we can't exactly stop an impulse from rising, but we can decline to act on it. That's what that means, the power of free won't. And by doing so, we weaken the impulse from rising in the future. And Jeffrey Schwartz is his name. So I'm just going to go through some brain basics. Try and get the big picture of it and find interesting things to write down. You're not being tested on the minute details in this content. So first off, the brain only weighs about 2% of our total body weight on average, but it accounts for 20% of our blood and oxygen use. So we, our bodies, are investing a lot of resources in our brains. So we know our whole bodies are composed of cells, different kinds of cells that emerged when we were developing to serve different functions within our body. You can see all these variety of cells, and we know that most of these cells die and regenerate all the time. I mean, our skin cells, you know, thank goodness, right? Or we have our scabs that we got for a very long time. They're regenerated. Neurons are different. Most of our neurons are formed in the first 12 weeks, the first trimester of pregnancy. Virgie, that baby, has her neurons already formed. The ones that he or she will have the rest of that baby's life. Right now, what the neurons are doing in a baby, an infant, or a fetus that's developing in the second and third trimesters, the neurons are traveling to where they need to go and starting to get connected with other neurons, making friends. Our neurons are dynamic. They stay with us because they can learn. And whatever we ask of it, those are the things it becomes good at. Now, one exception to this rule of the quick death of cells are our heart cells. And we know that the original Greek conception of mind was a combination of brain and heart. So the heart cells, about half the cells in the heart of a 50-year-old were present at his or her birth. So there's some regeneration in the heart cells, but the heart cells too seem to be able to learn. This is a lecture I heard a few years back in front of a huge audience at the University of Arizona from a professor, and I even have her lecture posted on here. And so she's doing work in this area, among other people. So you can see nervous system, nervous, and of course that's referring to nerves. And so when we think about the cells in our brain, well, the cells also exist, neurons also exist in our nervous system, in all of these nerves that travel throughout the body. Central nervous system, we're dependent on that for basic function in our organs and our body parts and connecting all of those to our brain. And then the peripheral nerves that extend out from the central nerves and gives function and senses in our limbs and our extremities. Don't worry about efferent, afferent. An interesting nerve is a nerve called the vagus nerve. It wanders throughout the body. It's the largest nerve in our body. It's linked to the brain, and it connects all of our internal organs to the brain, including digestive functions, including your heart, and also extremities at the region of the throat and the back of the ear. if you're familiar with the terms sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, you know that your sympathetic nervous system is what makes your heart race fast when you're scared, right? It makes your digestion stop when you're scared. And your parasympathetic is what calms you down again. The vagus nerve, is the main nerves connecting the parasympathetic nervous system. So the vagus nerve, when stimulated, will relax you after stress. And if you look at the picture of the vagus nerve, you can see that this vagus nerve has all kinds of connections with your internal organs. They're all linked together. When you are stressed, you know, your heart beats faster and you don't digest your food, right? But notice all of these in the region of the heart also. A lot of nerve cells in that region of the heart. And so these are interconnected. It's sometimes thought of that our heart itself is a little brain. We think of it in the Western tradition as just a muscle, pumping blood through your body. And it's definitely a muscle pumping blood through your body. But it also has about 40,000 nerve cells, which means cells that use electrochemical energy and can adapt to new situations. And you can see these nerve cells in the heart in yellow. And so sometimes people refer to it as the little brain because it has cells like the brain and nervous system. So it's well integrated in our body and connecting our body and brain. The nerve cells that do reside in our heart, they're not different from the nerve cells in the brain. They work the same way. So what is the vagus nerve listening to? So what's it attending to? And this is from that talk I mentioned by Dr. Katalin Goddard. And so we just know, are these nerve cells responding to the brain and telling the heart what to do? Or are these nerve cells responding to what the heart is doing and telling the brain how to respond? So in other words, do you get scared first and then your vagus nerve or the nerve sends a message down to the nerve cells in your heart and says, start beating faster? Or does the heart start beating faster and then the message goes up to your brain? And Dr. Katalin suggests that the vagus nerve is mostly afferent messages. Afferent messages are going through the organs, from the organs through the heart to the brain. So in other words, they're going up into the brain from the organs. So what's happening in the organs of our bodies is informing our thinking and our subjective experience, about 80%. So looking at this image, the content of our thoughts determines the state of our body. And if I ask you right now to think about the last argument you had with someone, really think about it, will your heart start beating faster? Yeah. Will you feel a little tightening in your jaw? Where's that coming from? This is a thought that's controlling your body. But your body is picking up things that your brain doesn't know about, and 80% of those messages are going upward. So it's really important, the things that are happening in your body. And I did post her talk here, which we won't listen to now, but I strongly recommend it. It was a remarkable talk. We already know about this. We've already looked at the dendrites, the axon, the nodes of Ranvier, the myelin, the axon terminals, and all that. We know about the presynaptic, we know about the neurotransmitters. And we know that neurons connect with other neurons in order to let us do something. Happens very rapidly. Here's that little GIF of myelin that I said I would show you. So a healthy cell has this myelin flowing smoothly, jumping the nodes of Ranvier and getting to do its job. Here we have scarred myelin, maybe someone who's older, and you can see the signal is released, and look at the difference in the size of the signal from the healthy neuron to the non-healthy neuron. So you can see the signal is lost. whatever it is that this neurons were trying to communicate and do this for this person, they can't do because they're damaged. So once again, we've already gone through that neurons just leave these messages, neurotransmitters received by the postsynaptic neuron. So let's look a little bit at infants so that we can think about neuroplasticity. All right, so these are neurons. Neurons at 36 weeks gestation, neurons in the newborn, at 3 months of age, at 6 months, at 2 years, at 4 years, at 6 years. Which one appears to have the densest or the greatest number of neurons in all these? Just from our view.
2 years.
Sort of looks like the 2-year-old, right? What we actually find is at this 36 weeks gestation, there are probably more neurons. There are more neurons, never mind, there are more neurons, but they're not developed, right? They're teeny little things that are not connected up, so we can't really see them. Now this baby's born, they're starting to have experiences, they're experiencing cold and mama's love and all that, and you can see how they're starting to connect up and develop a little bit more dendrites maybe, starting to begin to connect up with other neurons. Tree is growing. At 3 months, you can see how there's a lot more experience. The neurons are connecting up even more. It's called synapse formation. Synapses are those gaps between the neurons. At 6 months, tons and tons of experiences. Look at the gray matter. You can see why it's called gray matter now, right? Because it's black in here, but you know, it's gray. There's a lot going on there. And the 2-year-old, tons and tons of experience, right? But then as the child gets older, the brain says, okay, now we've developed a lot of neurons and have a lot of connections. Now let's find out what this child actually needs. And so then it starts to strengthen the pathways that the child needs a lot and get rid of the pathways that it's not using. So it looks like our 6-year-old has fewer neurons, and the 6-year-old does have fewer neurons, but the ones that it has have learned a lot, are connected up, are serving what the child is asking of it a lot more. Synaptic formation, synapse pruning. This happens again for a second time at a really high level during adolescence. First, a period of rapid growth, and then pruning. So what a child does during adolescence matters. Okay. Sort of another look at this. We can see this pruning happening again here. And now the question that we ask is, to what extent can a child recover function? And you, I think, asked this question earlier. We're going to watch a short video about a little girl who was having seizures and actually had to have good portions of one hemisphere of her brain removed. And the question is, you can see here, Rasmussen syndrome is a syndrome where she has seizures on one part of her brain. And we're going to watch the little video. It's pretty incredible. It's kind of bad resolution, but still pretty incredible.
We are beginning to harness the brain's incredible ability to invent itself, then reinvent itself throughout life. This girl is a testament to the amazing resilience of the human brain. Young Jody Miller leads an idyllic life as a 9-year-old girl. You would never guess that she has undergone some of the most drastic surgery imaginable. Jody's first 3 years were textbook normal.
Happy birthday, dear Jody.
Then, about 6 weeks after her 3rd birthday, a storm of epileptic seizures took control of her brain.
She couldn't use her left arm hardly at all. She could barely use the left leg, seizing a good deal of the time, multiple types of seizures.
Ordinary life became impossible. Medicines did nothing, and the seizures threatened to turn fatal. Desperate, Jody's parents brought her to pediatric neurologist Eileen Vining.
We found her seizures were all coming from her right hemisphere. And we knew that there is virtually nothing else, nothing but Rasmussen syndrome that can produce that picture in a young child.
Rasmussen syndrome is a degenerative brain disorder that disrupts the electrical activity that makes our brains work. Tiny electrical explosions were flaring up in Jody's right hemisphere. As seizures became almost constant, she lost control of her left side. Only one radical treatment option remained.
We knew that she was never going to have her seizures controlled with medicine, and we knew that she and her family faced taking out that half of the brain.
Okay.
Dr. Vining recommended a daring surgery called a hemispherectomy. It would be performed by pediatric neurosurgeon Ben Carson.
The whole concept of taking out half of a person's brain would seem to most people impossible. Human beings are incredible creatures with a brain that is beyond belief in terms of its capabilities, to the point where we can take half of it out and still function in a normal way.
85% of our brain consists of the cerebral cortex, which is divided into two hemispheres, each with 4 main lobes. The cortex handles many of our higher functions. Areas on both sides control thinking, movement, and sensation. But the right side controls our left side and vice versa. Jody would lose almost all of her right hemisphere, and the cavity would fill with cerebrospinal fluid. The operation has to be performed with great precision to avoid damaging the parts of the brain that control Jody's life functions, like heartbeat and breathing. The surgery went flawlessly.
What we're looking at here is an image, an MRI, that was done on Jody after her surgery. And what it shows us is the fact that we removed her entire right hemisphere. And what we're able to see here is indeed her very normal left hemisphere and all the beautiful gyri of her cortex. And we can see right down the middle, the right hemisphere that was there is now replaced by fluid.
But how could Jody function normally with only one hemisphere? It's because of a miraculous ability of the brain called plasticity. Our brains can actually change shape, creating new connections between neurons or brain cells to replace lost or damaged ones. Jody's left brain started reconnecting almost immediately.
At least as good as this. And if I remember, you were pink just like you. This young lady had half her brain removed, went home, I guess maybe 10 days later, and was already walking. She was ambulating. She was able to walk out of the hospital. And that's because her left hemisphere had such resilience, such plasticity. It was able to say, okay, something needs to move her left leg. Whoa. You gonna open it? Okay.
Jody continues to work on training her brain to overcome the slight paralysis in her left side.
But enough. Now that's very good. You need to do that stretching stuff, honey. You know that, don't you? Are you doing enough of it? I think so. Atomic sentence.
The human brain is just an awesome thing, because every time I look at it, I say to myself, this is the thing that makes this person unique. It still is just such a wonderful thing to find a young person whose life now can move on, who's no longer having seizures, who's developing in a normal fashion. I take the good with the bad, and I say, this is a bad thing, potentially, that we have to do for an extremely good cause.
So, here's neuroplasticity. Huh? So the child's brain is really plastic, for good or for bad. If good things are happening to the child, the brain can develop really good things. The brain can recover much more quickly than an adult brain. It's also vulnerable. If bad things are happening, toxins, lead, drugs, the impact will also be greater. So she actually did still not have all of her function, like mathematics, I understand, was really hard for her to work with. That's a right, typically a right brain function. So she didn't develop as 100%, but pretty darn good. And we know that neuroplasticity is definitely possible in childhood, and that was just one example. The old saying is neurons that fire together wire together. The pathways you use are the pathways that get strong. But what about in adulthood? So we know our brains aren't hardwired, but you know, if we cover our eye for 8 weeks, we're not going to lose our sight. But weaken it, not going to lose it. So what about adulthood? And the work of Mersenich and Nudo, I've just been so interested in this because I read about how they did it, but they decided to map the adult brain of a primate. So they start with animals and they'll get into humans. And so they anesthetized the primate. And they had to do this all in one sitting, which took like several days, and their students, their grad students, when they're doing this work, and they had to touch or get an electrode on every single neuron in the brain. And then they would like touch a place on the hand, and then they find out what neuron was firing. So they got a complete map of the brain. Then they woke the primate up and just let it go back to its previous life, except they did put its food into like a well that required it to have some finger dexterity in particular. And then a couple months later, they mapped the whole thing again, did this whole thing over again. And what do you think they found? Was every neuron exactly firing for the same spot on the hand? I mean, they had mapped it. Exactly what neurons firing when they touched every spot on the hand. Was it the same after a couple months? Yes or no?
I don't think so.
You think correctly. Why not?
Because he learned how to use his hand in a different way.
Yeah. He
Like,
learned how to use it in a different way. What if he had just had a normal life? Do you think it would have still been the same if they hadn't even taught him that finger well trick?
I don't think so because he's going through new experiences and seeing new things.
Exactly. Like maybe he gets like a little pimple on his cheek, you know, and he spends a lot of time itching it and learns to kind of itch it just right away. And so the neurons are changing. So the neurons always are changing their jobs depending on what we need, which is pretty cool, right? Then they did a couple more things. So first off, this is a representation of the fingers. We'll look at this homunculus if we have time today. So we can see that this is the region of the brain. Remember up here, this is where our body is represented in the brain. And we can see it might have looked something like this. Before the training, maybe this is what the corticoreceptive fields look like. And then after the training, well, you can see bigger receptive fields in the thumb and these four fingers that he had to use maybe to get these out of the brain. And we see shifts actually in the region of the brain devoted to the fingers. So we see both structural differences and functional differences after 2 months. So the brain is our servant. All right, next question. They did another study. I could not find a picture of a primate with 2 fingers taped together, but essentially they secured 2 primates' fingers together. Okay, and they already had the map of the brain. So what happened to the brain map of the hand when they stitched these 2 fingers together for 6 weeks? This is the brain map, and you can see that there's a separate area for each finger, right? Before and after. All right. So what do you think happened to that brain map after these 2 fingers were stitched together? The only way one finger could move is if the other one moved.
The areas of the brain probably merged together with those 2 fingers.
Oh yeah, who is it who's saying that? Kaiba, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I couldn't see who you're, yeah, that's exactly what happened. There's one brain map for both fingers. There was no longer a distinction. So when they took the stitches out, that primate couldn't move his fingers separately. Do you think it would be ever possible for this primate to be able to move his 2 fingers separately?
Well, actually, yes, if you would do the same test and also factor, then I think it would
Yeah, how exactly would you go about doing it? We have to tease apart these two brain regions.
Yeah.
How would we do it? You'd probably have to secure so that the primate could only move one finger at a time. You know, maybe you take down one finger, they can move this one, take down this finger, move the other one. Eventually it would retrain itself. But this is like bad habits too. Like for some people who back when smoking was a certain thing, was more prevalent, a lot of people associated smoking with some certain thing. Like after a meal, they would want to have a cigarette. It's the same thing. It's like they've taped together in their brain this finishing meal, having cigarette. They've done them together so many times that it's like they've taped their two habits together. And so it's the same thing. There has to be one without the other in order for that to change. Okay, so is this just primates and children? Or what about we adults? And this is a story of what's called focal dystonia. This isn't the actual woman who this happened to. But this is a woman who really wanted to make it into this symphony orchestra. And there was a certain piece that she had to play in order to audition to be in this orchestra. She was practicing like 10, 12 hours a day on this one piece. And if you've ever played the piano, you know that the things the left hand does are often chords. And so you're often pressing two fingers at the same time repeatedly, right? And when it came close to her actual audition, she could not, her fingers were tending to move together, right? Like she was not able to control the fingers as she wanted to on her left hand. And she couldn't do the audition. She lost her chance. And eventually she went to a doctor. And the doctor is like, as they often are, there's nothing wrong with you. It's all in your head. And the truth is, it was true. It was all in her brain. Just like what happened to the monkey, she had repeated that motion of moving those two fingers at the same time for so long that she developed focal dystonia. And if we look at what happened in her brain, let me just see what's coming. Okay. This is the normal brain. This is a representation of the 5 fingers. This is focal dystonia, and it's just like Kaiva said, these two areas merge together. After they rework it and keep moving one finger without the other, you can see there's still some blurring, but this has increased. And you might experience a little of this in your feet. Like it's really hard to move certain toes independently of the other toe, or to do certain hand movements independently for this very same reason. It's not an abnormality, it's just that we've never demanded those two to function separately. Okay, so I have to pause here, I don't want to, but yeah. So I wanted to go into the neuromechanism with you. So I'll look at our content for next week and see if we want to continue. I put your quiz up, but I didn't put your other content up because I wanted to just give a chance to see how far we got today. So I'll look and see if we can combine this and finish it next week, and then I'll put your activity up for you. The activity that I had planned for you relates to this image. And I probably will still post it for you. And this image just shows us the homunculus, which is this weird looking guy. This is proportional to the space devoted to receiving and giving information to these parts of the body. So you can see that the area devoted, say, to head, lips, tongue is about as much neural space as the body as the amount devoted to the entire trunk and arms and legs of the body. So there's a little test that we can do that involves finding a partner and asking them to close your eyes or blindfolding them. And then you're going to touch them with, if you have pins or like an unfolded paper clip or something with a very fine tip, you're going to start at 1 centimeter apart with the 2 pin tips and touch them. Say you start with their hand, touch them on the palm of the hand with either 2 pin tips or 1, and ask them, how many did you feel, 1 or 2? And then they'll tell you, and you do that a few times, and then you move them a little closer together, you do it again, move it a little closer together, do it again. And